Sometime in the past year, inside a data center no outside journalist has photographed, roughly 50,000 chips that do not belong to Nvidia ran for weeks. At the end of it, a large language model called LongCat existed. No press release attached a price tag to it. No filing listed the operational cost. The announcement named the achievement and stopped there. What did that actually cost to train? LongCat is the anchor here. One training run, one unnamed facility, one number that does not appear anywhere in public record. Everything that follows is an attempt to understand why. The first answer most people land on is also the most intuitive. 50,000 chips. The inference writes itself. A chip count that large implies a cost that is large but manageable. And the existence of the run proves the chips were there in sufficient volume. China has the domestic accelerators now, the argument goes, so it trained the model, and the cost was whatever it was. The specific hardware mix has not been confirmed publicly, but Huawei's Ascend line is the most frequently cited candidate, and reports suggest domestic accelerators exist in volume sufficient for a run of this scale. Stack 50,000 accelerator cards flat. At roughly 2 centimeters each, that column rises taller than a 30-story building. Now imagine every card in that column needs active cooling, a dedicated power connection, and a network link fast enough that the whole stack behaves as a single machine. The engineering problem is not the chips. It is making that tower think as one. But counting those chips to estimate training cost is like counting the number of buckets used to fill a reservoir. What you actually want to know is how long people were hauling and how far the water source was. The bucket count tells you almost nothing about either. 50,000 fast chips running for 3 weeks and 50,000 slower chips running for 5 months produce entirely different costs. The chip count alone cannot tell you which one this was. My first instinct was that the silence was ordinary corporate behavior. Companies rarely publish training costs. But LongCat was announced specifically to demonstrate self-sufficiency. If the point of the announcement was that China can do this without Nvidia, then the cost is part of the demonstration. A country that can train at the frontier cheaply is in a different position than one that can train at the frontier expensively. Choosing not to publish the cost, given that framing, is a choice with a reason. So, what did LongCat actually cost to train? The real denominator is not chips. It is compute hours, multiplied by power draw, multiplied by yield across the full duration of the run, including the portions that failed and had to be restarted. A training run on hardware that is 1 or 2 generations behind the current frontier requires more gradient steps, more passes through the data, more wall clock time to converge to an equivalent loss. The cost is not the purchase price of the hardware. It is the operational burn rate across every hour the run was alive, including the hours spent recovering from interruptions. I want to test a hypothesis here. The power cost per useful token trained is probably the single number that would most directly let an outside analyst calculate how far behind domestic accelerators actually are relative to the leading edge. If that is true, then the absent cost figure is not modesty. It is the one figure that makes the performance gap legible to anyone doing the arithmetic. Independent infrastructure analysts have noted, without specific figures for LongCat, that trailing node accelerators typically require meaningfully more time and energy to reach equivalent training throughput. Huawei's Ascend 910B is the most discussed domestic alternative, and its published specifications suggest a gap versus Nvidia's H100 generation, though independent benchmark confirmation remains limited. Power consumption at data center scale is not entirely opaque. Grid operators see it. Satellite imagery analysts can sometimes estimate heat signatures, but duration and failure rate and chip-level throttling are internal numbers, and without them, even a good power estimate floats free of a usable cost figure, which is where the third layer sits. So, what did LongCat actually cost to train? The cost is not missing because it is complicated to calculate. It is missing because publishing it would answer a question no one on the announcing side wants answered. How much more expensive is a Frontier training run without access to leading-edge fabrication? That ratio is precisely what export controls were designed to impose. State the cost, and you state the premium. State the premium, and you give outside analysts a direct readout on how much policy pressure is actually biting. This is inference, not a documented claim, but it is grounded inference. The United States Commerce Department's successive tightening of the entity list, and then the restrictions on the H800 and A800 variants, followed each workaround in turn. The pattern suggests the target was always a compute threshold, not any specific part number. If LongCat's training cost is 2 or 3 times what a comparable run on unrestricted hardware would cost, that figure directly quantifies policy effectiveness. It also quantifies domestic shortfall. Neither side has a clean incentive to publish it. A lock on a door tells you the room matters. A lock with no sign on it tells you something more specific. Whoever sealed it did not want you to know what was worth sealing. The missing cost figure is that second kind of lock, not the padlock on a storage unit, the unmarked door in an otherwise well-labeled building. But I want to push back on my own argument, because it has a real hole in it. Concealment requires intent, and intent requires agreement. The simpler explanation is that no one inside the organization agreed on how to count the cost. Failed runs, chips that throttled under sustained load, wafers that did not yield at specification. Each of those complicates the accounting in ways that are genuinely hard to resolve. Rather than publish a number that internal teams would immediately dispute, they published nothing. That is not a cover operation. That is committee dysfunction. I think both things are probably true simultaneously, and that overlap is what makes the silence interesting rather than simply suspicious. The bullish reading is that LongCat runs close to its claimed performance. The cost premium over an unrestricted alternative is modest, and the silence reflects accounting disagreement rather than embarrassing economics. In this version, the domestic compute stack is further along than outside analysts credit, and the capability claim stands on its own without needing a cost defense. The bearish reading is that the cost was high enough relative to comparable Frontier runs that publishing it would undermine the self-sufficiency narrative entirely. The capability exists, but the economics are not competitive, and the gap is wider than any official statement would admit. Both readings assume you can cleanly separate capability from cost. That is probably the wrong frame. A training capability you can afford to use once or twice per year is a different kind of capability than one you can iterate on weekly. The cost figure is the only way to know which kind LongCat represents. Without it, the capability claim is real and incomplete at the same time, which means the driving question was slightly off from the start. Asking what LongCat cost assumes the cost exists as a stable number that someone calculated, knows, and chose not to share. The sharper question is whether the cost is even stably calculable given the complexity of the run, and if it is, why the announcement was structured to make us believe it should be public while ensuring it never would be. What does it mean that a Frontier training run was announced with capability claims and no cost basis? It means the run is simultaneously evidence of capability and a screen for economics. Domestic audiences read the capability. Foreign analysts stare at the silence. Both audiences are meant to draw conclusions, and the conclusions are different. My read is that this is not concealment in any dramatic sense. It is strategic ambiguity. A specific cost figure would constrain the narrative for one audience or the other, and leaving it unspecified lets the announcement do two jobs at once. That is a rational communications choice. It is also, if you are genuinely trying to assess the state of China's domestic compute infrastructure, the most informative thing about the announcement. LongCat exists. The run happened. The chips were there. What we do not have is the price of the door. And the lock, as I said near the start, is the most honest signal the announcement produced. The thing about an unmarked lock is that it tells you exactly as much as a sign would, just in the opposite direction. If you had to estimate the sanction premium today, meaning how much more expensive a Frontier training run is on current domestic hardware versus an unrestricted alternative stack, what would you put it at? And what are you basing that on? I want to see the reasoning in the comments, not just the number. If this kind of inside-out reading of industrial strategy is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more of this coming.